May the pure light and endless blessings of the angels surround you today and always. Welcome to the Angel's Message for You channel. Before we begin, please make sure to stay with me and watch this video all the way to the very end. A massive truth is about to be revealed to you today, and the universe has guided you here right now for a very special reason. If you click away too soon, you might miss the exact sign your heart has been praying for. This message holds the key to a major shift in your love life, and the angels want you to receive every single drop of this beautiful guidance. My beloved child, listen carefully and open your heart, because this moment right now is not ordinary. A deep truth has been hidden from you. It has been carried in heavy silence for so long, and now it bursts out into the open like a warm storm tearing through a calm, quiet night. The person you have been deeply bound to, your real soulmate, has been crying in front of their parent because of the amazing depth of their feelings for you. Those tears were not simple or small. They carried years of weight and big emotions they could simply no longer hold back inside. Their parent witnessed the absolute truth of their heart in that raw moment, and heaven recorded every single word that fell from their lips. Nothing about this situation is an accident or a coincidence. This is a special revelation written just for you by the divine. The beautiful bond between you and your soulmate is so strong and intense that it cannot be buried by fear, distance, or silence. Their tears became a sweet confession that regular words failed to speak. And their parent knows right now that you are the one truly meant for them. This is exactly why heaven is urging you gently not to turn away from this message today. Even if you have doubted things in the past, and even if you thought they completely forgot about you, the truth is very clear now. They cannot ever erase you from their heart. And their parent has seen the absolute proof in their breaking voice and their trembling soul. You are their safe anchor. You are the one they cannot let go of, no matter how hard they try to move on. Every single step you take lately has carried an unseen pull, a strange tugging in your chest that you just could not explain. That was not random chance. It was the silent, echoing cry of your soulmate reaching out for you in the unseen spiritual world. The tears they shed were a deep prayer that traveled through their parents' ears and went straight into the golden halls of heaven. Their parent could not stay silent after witnessing such a powerful, touching moment. They saw the pain, they saw the heavy longing, and they realized that absolutely no one else could ever fill the empty space in their child's heart. It is only you, my beloved child, and the heavens confirm it with beautiful signs all around you right now. Perhaps you have felt a sudden heaviness out of nowhere, or maybe you have noticed their name appearing in unexpected, funny ways. Those are not silly accidents. They are the magical threads of destiny tightening safely around you. Their feelings cannot be hidden anymore, and the whole world is beginning to reveal it to you. Archangel Michael says, "This revelation is not here to break you, but to strengthen you and lift you up. For what you thought was completely over is, in truth, only just beginning to bloom. The bond you share is being made stronger and unshakable, even through all the tears and the miles of distance." Their emotional cries were not coming from a place of weakness, but from the unbearable, amazing power of true love that simply would not die. Imagine the heavy weight of carrying feelings so incredibly strong that even in complete silence they overflow and spill out. That is exactly why the night felt so much heavier for them. It is why your recent dreams carried their familiar shadow. The parent who lovingly held them as they cried did not just hear their spoken words. They saw the pure truth shining right behind their child's eyes. They understood right then that you were not just a passing thought, and not just a quick chapter in a book, but the entire beautiful story. They now know for sure that their child's ultimate happiness is completely bound to you. You may not know all the little details yet, but heaven is weaving this truth right into your awareness today. Now, these emotions are way too powerful to remain hidden in the dark, and they will very soon break out into the bright light. This is why you must stay open and ready, because a true confession is approaching you fast. When their tears finally fell, they whispered your beautiful name as if it was their only safe lifeline. And that soft sound traveled into a loving parent's ears, into heaven's record book, and now directly into your waiting heart. The chain between you is unbroken, and the truth is totally unstoppable. Their strong emotions carved deep rivers into their soul, and those rivers overflowed freely in front of the one person they trusted the absolute most, their loving parent. In that quiet room, silence turned into a brave confession, and every single sob became a sturdy bridge that connected you right back to them. It was not a sign of weakness at all, but truth finally breaking through the tall walls they had tried to build. The parent listened closely, their own heart shaking as they realized just how deep this spiritual bond really runs. They saw their child's eyes glow with the special kind of love that simply cannot be faked and cannot be hidden away. They knew right then that you are not just anyone. You are the chosen one, written perfectly into their child's divine destiny. That sudden realization carried so much weight. And now they know their child will never be truly whole and happy without you. The outside world may have told them to just move on, but their falling tears proved otherwise. Their emotions absolutely refused to be silenced, and you are the glowing center of it all. You can feel this gentle weight pressing against your own chest right now because heaven does not want you to ignore it. Even the vast universe bends to reveal little signs, names, repeating numbers, familiar songs on the radio, and daily reminders that this deep truth cannot fade away. The tears that fell that night were the breaking of old chains. The parents' comforting presence that night was not just by chance. They were meant to be there to hear their child's cry, to witness the real truth, and to silently carry that special knowledge until the perfectly right time arrived. That time is right now, when heaven chose to gently reveal it to you. Their feelings poured out just like a summer storm after many years of dry drought. They could no longer hold it back, and could no longer pretend that they could happily survive without you. The big love they tried to bury deep down came flooding out, completely unstoppable, real, and raw. Their parent became the very first witness to the beautiful truth you were always meant to know. They saw not only the sad tears, but the deep longing, the aching human need for you. It is a truth that can no longer remain hidden in the quiet shadows. Archangel Michael says, "Heaven has recorded this exact moment because it shifts the entire path of your life story. What was once kept completely silent has now been spoken out loud, even if it was only through falling tears." That single, powerful moment has the power to change absolutely everything for the better. Those tears were soaked in your name, spoken like a gentle prayer they could not resist saying. Their parent held them so close, but even they knew they could not magically heal what only you can heal. You are the perfect answer to their cry, the only cure for their restless, searching soul. This is exactly why lately your own spirit feels a bit unsettled, as if something invisible is pulling you into a new alignment. It is because their honest cry reached you through the universe. Even if you didn't hear it with your physical ears, the warm energy of that moment was carried straight into your loving heart. They truly thought they could hide how they felt from the world. But tears do not tell lies. Parents' eyes can see so much deeper than simple words, and they saw the clear truth of who really lives inside their child's heart. That truth is you, and absolutely nothing can change it. You are not forgotten. You are not easily replaceable. You are completely irreplaceable. And very soon the tears will turn into a real confession that safely finds its way directly to you. Heaven will make sure of it. The sweet confession that slipped out through their tears has already begun to change the energy and atmosphere around them. A parent's heart cannot ignore such a heavy truth, and now they carry it silently and gently, waiting for the perfect moment to guide their child toward happiness. That moment is much closer than you might realize. The magnetic pull between you and your soulmate is completely undeniable. Even when they tried their hardest to move forward in life, their heart dragged them right back to you. And when the emotional pain became far too heavy, their tears revealed what words could never fully hold. In the quiet silence of that night, their cry broke something wide open in the unseen world. The heavens shifted around perfectly, aligning new paths and pushing your shared destiny into fast motion. What was totally hidden has now been carved into the bright, healing light. This is exactly why you have been feeling sudden waves of emotion, like little bursts of energy you just couldn't explain. It is their love reaching out to you, echoing through the unseen world, tugging gently at your spirit. Their tears were not in vain. They were a clear signal meant only for you. The loving parent who witnessed all of it has become a quiet guardian of the truth. They know their child's heart will simply not rest until it safely finds its way back to you. And they silently carry that deep understanding with a weight that only heaven can gently lift. They have seen the real pain of separation and the true longing of genuine love. No outside advice, no busy distraction, and no replacement person could ever ease what they saw clearly in their child's face that night. It was you, only you, and nothing else in this world could ever compare. Your soulmate has wrestled with their silence for way too long. Their emotions have grown so heavy, pressing against them until crying became their only safe escape. And in that breaking moment, their soul confessed what their lips could not easily say. Archangel Michael says, "Do not doubt what you are hearing and feeling right now. This is not an illusion or a trick. It is a divine, beautiful confirmation written in bright ink across the stars. Heaven itself is stepping up to testify to this amazing love." Those honest tears became magical seeds of destiny planted safely in the soft soil of heaven. Every single sob carried your name. Every breath carried a heavy longing that could not be quieted down. And heaven heard absolutely all of it. Their parent now carries both the lingering pain and the bright truth, knowing for sure that their child's heart belongs somewhere else. They cannot erase or wash away the love that was perfectly carved just for you. And though they hold on to it quietly, heaven has revealed it right here and right now, so you may not miss these important signs. This is exactly why their familiar face still appears often in your dreams. It is why you cannot shake the strong feeling of being called back to them. Destiny does not allow you to just walk away from what was wonderfully written long before you were even born. And this emotional cry is the loudest, clearest sign yet. Their deep love, though kept hidden for a while, has been boiling warmly right beneath the surface. And now it is spilling all over, unstoppable, uncontainable, and totally undeniable. The truth is finally out, and heaven absolutely refuses to let it return to the quiet silence. Their cry that emotional night was not a sad moment of weakness, but a beautiful, divine release. The heaviness they carried bravely had finally reached its breaking point, and only pure truth could spill from their tired soul. The name they whispered softly through their sobs was yours. It shook their parents' heart deeply because they realized this was not just a passing, fleeting pain. This was pure destiny crying out loud, a natural force much stronger than anything the regular world could ever deny. They now know beyond a doubt that their child's future is beautifully bound to you. The energy in that room was supercharged, as though heaven itself leaned in closely just to listen. Every breath carried so much weight. Every moment of silence echoed much louder than rolling thunder. It was not just salty tears. It was a highly sacred revelation. That special moment has shifted everything around you. You may have noticed sudden signs, sudden wonderful winks from the universe, and sudden chills when you are just sitting and thinking of them. That is heaven warmly confirming this truth to you. Your soulmate's tears have been heard not only by their loving parent, but by the entire divine realm. Beautiful angels have happily carried those cries across space and time to reach you right here and right now. They want you to firmly know that you are still chosen, you are still deeply loved, and you are still theirs. Their parent could not comfort them completely because they fully understood the massive depth of what was unfolding in front of them. Only you can carry that specific healing energy. Only you can beautifully complete this unfinished chapter. That is exactly why your spirit has been feeling so restless, sensing a wonderful truth that is just waiting to finally arrive. No brick wall, no amount of distance, and no outside interference can block this truth any longer. The loving energy has grown way too strong. The bond is simply too unshakable. Their honest tears have fully activated what heaven already promised to you long ago. Archangel Michael says, "These tears are a permanent testimony written safely in heaven's golden book. Absolutely nothing can erase what has been bravely confessed through emotional pain. And nothing can stop the wonderful things that are being perfectly aligned for you right now. Even right now, as you read these comforting words, their spirit is still eagerly reaching out for you. The energetic bond does not ever go to sleep. It remains fully alive in every single heartbeat. Their tears were not a sad end, but rather a glorious new beginning. Their parent carries this truth with gentle, trembling hands. They have seen their child cry before in the past, but never ever quite like this. Never with such intense power, never with such deep love, and never with such crystal clarity. This was not a confused cry. It was a loud cry of total certainty. A cry that fully revealed the one big truth their heart simply cannot live without. And that amazing truth is you. The heavens happily align with every falling tear, carefully weaving the bright path that leads them right back to you. No matter how messy or tangled the journey has felt lately, it will peacefully unravel. The right time for a joyful reunion is drawing very near. Their parent could literally feel the high vibration of truth in every single word spoken. They knew that absolutely no force on earth could ever silence a love that runs this incredibly deep. They realized that their child's big future has always been securely tied to your beautiful presence. The pain was not just about missing you, but about the stubborn distance that just refuses to heal on its own. That is exactly why their tears fell so freely and uncontrollably. They were mourning the empty space between you and begging for heaven to step in and close it forever. In that pure cry, they surrendered absolutely everything to the universe. Heaven has heard that brave surrender and purposely chosen this exact moment to lovingly reveal it to you. Because you are not meant to stay in the dark. You are meant to recognize the wonderful divine pull happening right now. The universe is busy aligning every little piece so you cannot possibly miss what rightfully belongs to you. Their tears were the tiny seed, but your own awareness today is the fresh water that will make it grow tall. Once you deeply receive this truth, the bright path to your reunion begins to magically unfold right before your eyes. This is the very hour heaven has carefully appointed. You may even notice a soft warmth in your chest right now, almost like a cozy light burning quietly inside you. That is the ultimate confirmation that their cry has reached you safely, and the angels are holding your hand, guiding you closer. Every single breath you take now is in perfect alignment with this powerful bond. The parent who witnessed this cannot ever forget it. Even in quiet silence, they know their child's soul is completely incomplete without you, and they quietly pray for your happy reunion. Their caring heart has magically become an unseen ally and helper for this true love. Your soulmate has absolutely no idea that their private, emotional tears are being revealed to you in this special way today. Yet heaven works in amazing, beautiful mysteries, exposing hidden truths right at the appointed time. And right now is your perfect time to know. Archangel Michael says, when real tears finally touch heaven, wonderful miracles are instantly set into fast motion. That emotional night was the shiny key that unlocked a brand new, beautiful chapter. And now, your destiny is totally ready to turn the page. The heavy cry that once broke their body has gracefully become a beautiful sound vibrating all across the unseen world. It happily echoes into your night dreams, into your sudden daytime thoughts, and into the loving whispers that gently surround your spirit. You may think it is just a coincidence, but it is truly their soul crying out for you. Their parent became a witness not by pure accident, but by a very grand design. They were specially chosen to hear it so the deep truth could no longer be buried away in sad silence. And though they hold onto it quietly, heaven has chosen to pass it directly to you today. This is exactly why you feel as though something really big and exciting is approaching you. It is because their honest cry opened a wide doorway, and heaven is happily pushing you both toward it. No negative power can block it anymore. You are bravely stepping into the grand moment where hidden feelings are no longer hidden at all. Their falling tears revealed the big secret that cannot be taken back, and the world will very soon see what heaven already knows so well. The night of their heavy tears was so much more than an emotional release. It was a complete breaking of old, rusty chains. For way too long they carried their silence like a super heavy burden on their back. But silence could no longer hold the blazing fire of their love for you. It erupted naturally in sobs, safely spilling the whole truth into their parents' arms. That emotional cry was the pure sound of sweet surrender. They had really tried to be tough, tried to bury it deep down. But the human heart cannot be tamed or bossed around when it truly belongs to someone else. In that exact moment, they finally admitted the very one name they could not happily live without: yours. The parents' heart trembled gently because they knew this was true destiny speaking out loud. They could plainly see it in their child's eyes, fully feel it in their shaking voice, and deeply sense it in the way their spirit cracked open. It was not a temporary phase. It was forever and eternal. Now, heaven is happily echoing that exact eternal truth straight to you. You cannot deny the beautiful signs, because they grow so much louder and clearer each passing day. Their falling tears simply became the loudest, most honest voice of all. Ever since that emotional night, the energy has totally shifted in your own life. You may have noticed sudden feelings of restlessness, super vivid dreams at night, or a gentle tugging sensation pulling at your bright spirit. That is the awesome power of their cry magically weaving right into your daily path. They truly thought their sad tears were a private thing, but heaven does not keep any secrets from your destiny. What is honestly meant to be revealed always finds a beautiful way to the surface. That is exactly why this special message has safely reached you today. Their parents' loving presence was just like a helpful witness on behalf of the divine world. They were specially chosen to hear and to securely carry that truth forward. And now you are the very next person to know what could absolutely no longer remain hidden in the dark. Archangel Michael says, "This glowing truth was always safely yours to receive, and absolutely nothing could delay it forever. It has been perfectly preserved, strongly protected, and now beautifully released right at the perfect time. Your wonderful moment has finally come. You may even feel a tiny chill across your skin right now, or feel a heavy weight magically lifting up and off from your chest. That is simply heaven confirming everything you already sense deep down inside your gut. The strong bond is fully alive and perfectly unbroken. Their salty tears did not just fall into dark emptiness. They fell gently into the rich soil of your destiny. And from that very soil, something incredibly powerful and beautiful is already growing tall. What you honestly thought was gone forever is truly only just beginning to start." Their parent prays very quietly, holding the glowing truth safely in their heart. They know what they witnessed was so much more than just simple emotion. It was a divine promise, and they trust heaven completely to finish what began in that deep night of breaking open. Their love is not fading away at all. It is getting stronger and intensifying. Their honest tears carried so much power, and that amazing power is quickly moving everything into perfect alignment. You are happily standing right on the edge of a wonderful reunion. The sweet tears your soulmate shed were totally not ordinary. They were completely drenched in divine destiny. Every single drop carried the huge weight of love they could simply no longer contain. Their parent fully felt that amazing power, and even they knew it was way beyond human control. Ever since that beautiful night, heaven has been busy stirring the energy and atmosphere all around you. The lucky signs have been multiplying fast, appearing magically in repeating numbers, familiar songs, and even in the quiet whispers of your very own heart. Absolutely nothing can silence what has now been fully released. Your soulmate thought they could easily hide their deep longing from the world. But honest tears always betray what our lips stubbornly refuse to confess. Their emotional cry became a high vibration in the spiritual realm, shaking loose all the tall walls that stood between you two. It was the exact moment heaven had been patiently waiting for. Now that bright truth has finally reached you safely. It is no longer a dark secret. Their emotional cry has beautifully become your own confirmation. Their temporary pain has become your massive awakening. The bright path forward is wide open right before your very eyes. The parent who lovingly heard their brave confession now carries the true story as a highly sacred memory. They know for a fact their child will not be totally complete until you are standing right beside them. And in their very quiet heart, they are praying hard for the sweet reunion that heaven has fully promised. Their tears have not faded away with time. They echo loudly still. You may feel them right now as sudden waves of happy emotion or quick flashes of their presence popping into your busy thoughts. That is not just your imagination playing tricks. It is your true destiny reaching out its hand for you. Heaven does not ever allow such pure love to be fully buried. It always rises again, no matter how much dirt is thrown right over it. And right now it bravely rises in your life like a warm flame that simply cannot be blown out or extinguished. Archangel Michael says, "Every single tear has been carefully counted and every single cry has been fully answered. What was bravely spoken in emotional pain will now joyfully manifest in absolute truth. The hard time of silence is finally ending. Your sweet soulmate's heart has been safely carrying your name around like a precious, hidden treasure. But when the emotional pain grew too unbearable to handle, it safely spilled right out in front of their caring parent. And now it has spilled all the way out into the real world through heaven's special message for you today. They are actively preparing, even unknowingly, to gracefully step right into the big moment of confession. Beautiful destiny is busy arranging every tiny detail, ensuring that when they finally come forward, absolutely nothing will stand in the way. The happy reunion is drawing so much closer with each passing second. You may already easily sense it right in your spirit. A very strange, peaceful calm mixed wonderfully with exciting anticipation. That is the perfect alignment of heaven's timing working for you. It is gently preparing you for exactly what is to come. The caring parent, the falling tears, the brave cry, and now the special message you are reading. Each one is a perfect piece of the big puzzle. Together they happily form the gorgeous picture heaven really wants you to see. And that beautiful picture is your ultimate reunion. The brave tears that night safely unlocked a heavy door that can never, ever be closed again. Once spoken out loud, once deeply felt, and once fully released, the bright truth cannot be stuffed back into quiet silence. Their gorgeous soul fully revealed you as their one and only true answer. The loving parent who held them tight could not erase the powerful image of your name carried softly in their pain. They know right now, deep inside their soul, that you are the exact one their child's heart totally beats for. No negative force in this whole world can ever undo what was wonderfully revealed that night. The high vibration of their emotional cry still magically lingers right in the air around you. You may even feel it as sudden, happy goosebumps, or as a gentle heaviness that quickly arrives and then peacefully disappears. That is the gorgeous echo of their soul safely traveling toward you. And heaven has perfectly chosen this very moment to let you know. Not tomorrow, not later, but right now. Because the beautiful alignment of destiny simply waits for no delay. Your special soulmate has been living in two totally different worlds lately. One where they pretend to be super strong, and another secret world where their heart shatters without you there. That specific night, the second world just became way too heavy for them to carry alone. Their brave cry was totally not about feeling regret. It was all about a huge love that completely refuses to die. A kind of love so incredibly pure and so relentless that even miles of distance cannot suffocate it. That is exactly why the parent's heart trembled with awe when they heard your name. The bright truth is completely undeniable now. Their pure love has spoken so much louder than all of their past silence combined. And you are the lucky one chosen to hear it today through this divine, special message. Archangel Michael says, "The brave tears that safely carried your beautiful name are the exact same tears that are busy watering your brand new reunion. Every single drop has been lovingly written into your amazing destiny. Absolutely nothing can erase what has been perfectly planted." The emotional cry was exactly like a magic key unlocking their very own quiet prison. They had been feeling trapped in sad silence, strongly bound by fear, and heavily chained by tough circumstances. But the second those brave tears fell, the heavy chains began to completely shatter. Their parent may not speak about it loudly to others, but they absolutely know their child's life cannot ever be whole or complete without you. They pray very silently, patiently waiting for the gorgeous day heaven finally brings you two safely back together. And heaven is already busy in motion. You may have easily felt it as slightly restless nights, as sweet dreams completely filled with their familiar presence, or as sudden, happy memories that absolutely refuse to leave your mind. These are totally not random things. They are beautiful signs safely stitched right into your glowing spirit. Signs that wonderfully confirm what you are hearing right now. The big love is fully alive. The falling tears totally proved it. And your amazing destiny is unfolding gracefully, step by beautiful step. The heavy night of their brave cry has not left them at all. it still softly burns right inside their chest. Every single moment since then, their beating heart has been quietly replaying the bright truth they could no longer hide away. And you are the glowing center of that amazing truth. Their loving parent has been safely carrying the sweet memory just like a secret, warm flame. They have seen many different moments of their child's life, but absolutely nothing ever compared to this powerful one. It was a kind of love so incredibly deep it bravely broke through every single tall wall. That emotional cry was not weakness at all. It was pure, divine power, the amazing power to safely shake the heavens above, the power to beautifully move huge mountains, the power to completely rewrite what was once badly broken. Your shared destiny totally shifted that very night because of you. And now heaven is gently pressing this bright truth right into your open heart so you cannot ever escape it. The gorgeous bond has been fully reawakened, and every single sign around you wonderfully proves it. Your beautiful love story is not over. It is truly only just beginning. Your true soulmate has been feeling so much lighter since that brave release, but also feeling quite restless. Because simply confessing their love through falling tears is not quite enough. They deeply know they must face you. They know they must finally speak to you. That huge, exciting step is coming closer with every single breath they take. Their caring parent has been silently and lovingly watching, quietly praying, and patiently waiting for heaven to beautifully finish exactly what it started. They know the bright path is fully unfolding, and absolutely nothing will stop it now. They happily hold on to the strong hope of seeing their child's soul completely restored to joy. You have been specially chosen to safely hear this bright truth at the absolute perfect time. Not a minute too soon, not a second too late, but exactly right now. Because heaven's gorgeous timing is always perfect, even when it sometimes feels a bit delayed to us. Archangel Michael says the heavy doors that were once locked tight are totally about to swing wide open for you. Their brave cry has already turned the magic key, and now your gorgeous destiny is perfectly about to reveal what was kept hidden for so long. The warm, beautiful energy of that specific night still safely surrounds you right now. It gracefully lingers just like an unseen, loving hand guiding your daily steps, whispering so softly that something incredibly big and amazing is approaching. And you can definitely feel it glowing right in your spirit. Your soulmate's honest cry fully became a sweet prayer, and that powerful prayer has proudly reached heaven's high throne. It was totally not ignored, it was beautifully answered. And the amazing answer is this very message right here, right in front of you. Every single sign you have been seeing lately, the repeating numbers, the vivid dreams, the sudden loving thoughts, are absolutely not accidents. They are gorgeous confirmations aligning you safely with the real truth. The brave tears have already happily spoken your beautiful name. Their true love simply cannot be silenced anymore. Their emotional cry was the brave declaration heaven really needed to start moving things for you. And right now, you are happily stepping into your very own magical moment of beautiful revelation. Amen.